Welcome back, builders and riders. Many of my viewers over the past few years have commented on how they'd like to start their own YouTube channel, but budget is tight. So we're going to look at a budget action camera in today's video. This is the Akaso Brave 7. Now right off the bat, I'll tell you that this is a decent camera for the price. It has good video and audio quality. However, I've been spoiled by GoPro, Insta360, and Sony for years, so it's going to be a tough review on this little action camera. In my opinion, in order for a camera to claim the name action camera, it needs to be able to fulfill a few important criteria, which we'll point out throughout the video. Now, with this camera coming in the budget category that's usually 2 to 3 times cheaper than the high quality GoPros, I'll be a little more relaxed on my opinions about it, but they're still going to be honest, and I'll tell you if I think it's worth it. Before we jump straight into the review and point out the important features or lack of features that this camera has, I want to show you guys a short montage of different clips from this camera. These are in poor, decent, and optimum lighting conditions, and then we'll get back to them later in the video. Now, the main purpose of the montage you just saw, all recorded from the Brave 7, was to show you the end results with minimal effort. So despite what I'm about to say, positive or negative about this camera, these are the results you can expect. So most of you were either impressed with the footage, found it acceptable, or are looking for better options. That's for you to decide. Now let's move on to the review. Now, from what I've gathered, there's 2 versions of the Brave 7. There's the LE, which is their launch edition, and then the standard Brave 7, which is the newer edition. Their LE version can still be found on Amazon for $140 at the time of recording. This Brave 7 that we're looking at today comes in at $170 at the time of recording. Based off of comparisons I've seen from the two, I would recommend staying away from the LE and saving your money for other options. Focusing back in on our newer Brave 7, there's a lot of good things going for this camera, but I like to end on a high note, so I'm going to get the negatives out of the way first. And there's quite a few of them. However, I do urge you to finish watching this video because even if this camera is not one that you're interested in at the moment, a lot of the good things about it are features you would want to look for on more expensive options. I personally don't think the Brave 7 has earned the name action camera due to the lack of features. However, it could be a good life camera, and what I mean is that for average riding conditions where you're just cruising around and you want to record your trip with decent quality, this camera really shines, but it lacks a lot of the high-end features that I need for my videos. So far, the biggest negative I've seen on this camera is it has no usable 60 frame per second. It does have 1080p 60, but I tried using it and it just looked awful. The frame rate was there, but it was cropped in so much that this isn't footage I would be putting on my channel. In 2.7K, which is what I use mostly on all of my other cameras, and 4K, the quality is fine, but there's no 60 frames per second, and this is important for an action camera. 30 frames per second, in my opinion, is fine when you're recording the action from a distance. If you're focusing in on an object that's moving quickly, that's fine. But when the camera is mounted in the action where everything is moving by quickly, such as trees, cars, and other objects, 30 frames is just not enough in my opinion. 60 really smooths out the experience and is just easier to watch. My next biggest complaint about this camera is the field of view. When you have the image stabilization turned on, which for an action camera is an absolute must, it crops in the footage, as most cameras need to do this in order to smooth it out. But unfortunately, this camera doesn't have a wide enough field of view to start out with for my purposes. In a lot of situations, when I thought I had the camera mounted perfectly level with the horizon, it ended up being tilted down just a little too much. This is common for all of my cameras. However, on the GoPros, the field of view is so wide that it doesn't really matter if you're a little bit off in the camera's angle. This one you need to make sure is perfectly level with the horizon before you start recording. And a lot of the footage I tried to record for this camera, which would have been decent, turned out to be pointed down just way too much for me to use. However, in situations where you were able to mount the camera level with the horizon, such as this, it turned out pretty good. But what I'm getting at here is there's not a wide margin of error when mounting the camera, so double check that it's mounted level. Another downside to a narrow field of view is that it makes everything look slow. As you can see in this video, I'm riding at my average speed of 20 miles an hour, and it looks like I'm going about 15. Moving on, another downside on these budget cameras is their bitrate. Unfortunately, they do not record at a very high bitrate, but this is not necessarily a terrible thing. A lower bitrate means you can record much more video on your SD card. But unfortunately, when I like to pick the highlights, I want that footage to look as good as possible. And I noticed on the Brave 7, everything's just a little more grainy, almost as if it's been sharpened. The battery life when you're recording in 4K is not fantastic. I only got about 40 minutes of straight recording, which is honestly more than enough for most situations I use this camera on, and not terrible considering they give you 2 batteries with this camera and they're really easy to swap out. But in some situations that might be a negative for a lot of people. When Akaso reached out to me to see if I wanted to review this camera, I informed them that audio is very important to my viewers and I, and that if they had any available accessories that could help improve audio, such as a foamy windsock to cover the camera or an external microphone, I would recommend them sending it with the camera. Well, they sent me this huge bundle of accessories that has everything you could need for mounting it in just about any situation, and I'm impressed with the accessories that comes with the camera itself, along with this additional kit. Unfortunately, they didn't send anything to help with audio, so I did my best. I'm loving these new handlebars, machine, thank you. Very relaxed. Alright, so for camera settings, we're at 4K, 30 frames per second. All default settings except for the white balance. Even though it's an overcast day, I do have my white balance set to daylight. I found generally when I'm outdoors, whether it's sunny, overcast, even golden hour, I still like to stick with daylight white balance. I'm not saying it'll be a smooth ride, but it's got the power to conquer stuff like that. However, we're so far away from the house that if I was to push it down one of these trails, I could only really do 1 or 2 trails for a couple miles. and still have battery to get home.
Yeah.
So it says full throttle and then just slightly toss it
That's
up.
what it shows him do on the video.
Oh, not a lot of power on that sucker. Okay, there it goes.
So it goes up and down depending on the power of the propellers.
Yeah, so you'll
Wow, man, that thing.
All right, so after you get it up in the air, like you launch it with full throttle, throw it a little harder than I did. Now the camera has decent audio, but unfortunately the wind reduction option is unusable, and I would recommend staying away from it at all cost. It makes your voice sound really tinny, you can't hear the motor on the bike, and it's just not usable in my opinion. So for the redemption bike today, as you guys remember, this is the one we found in a ditch. We rebuilt it pretty much from the ground up so that it should be safe and reliable. However, with wind reduction off, the audio is still fine, even if you do hear a little bit of buffeting in the background. So I would recommend never using the wind reduction on this camera. Alright, now this is white balance set to daylight and exposure set to -1. This should look a little better. With all default settings, the camera does a decent job of white balance and exposure. It does tend to be a bit overexposed, but most action cameras, even GoPros, tend to do this. And unfortunately, in some situations, especially during golden hour, the camera can get confused with its color profile. So I highly recommend leaving this camera in daylight white balance at all times when you're recording outside. Whether it's an overcast day, golden hour, or the middle of a sunny day, I would recommend leaving the white balance set to daylight. And when I've done this, it actually does really well with colors. And my last negative before moving on to what I like about this camera is the image stabilization is only decent. Now it does fine when you're walking, riding over slight bumpy paths, or cruising down a smooth street. It gets rid of all the little engine vibrations, small potholes, and rough terrain. But anything that might jar you around a bit will cause the footage to look pretty jerky. In my opinion, this image stabilization is usable for most situations, and unless you plan on doing a lot of off-road mountain biking, it should be just fine for you. As we move on to the positives about this camera, I would like to applaud Akaso for trusting us with this review. They knew what they were stepping into when they sent us the camera. Having dealt with GoPros for years, I'm spoiled by quality. And this Brave 7, which is decent for most people, has a lot to stand up against. So those negatives were pretty harsh. For the average rider, here's what you're looking forward to. Because of its relatively low cost, this camera is a lot more comfortable to put in harm's way. It's completely waterproof out of the box without an additional case. It has replaceable lenses, and it's quite a bit lighter than any GoPro I've ever used. It manages to keep this weight down without feeling cheap and plasticky. Reduced weight is something that might be important to some bicyclists. When set to daylight outdoors, it has good color. And I found that the detail it records in 2.7 or 4K is more than enough for most situations. Because the audio on this camera is so decent, which is uncommon in action cameras, you can even use it as a bench camera. When using it as a bench camera, the narrower field of view can actually be a plus. It'll allow you to easily focus in on objects without looking blurry and out of focus, something that my GoPros struggle with, but this is always going to be a trade-off. This means more detail when used as a bench camera, but less field of view when used as an action camera. The watertight sealed latches on the camera for accessing your SD card, charge port, and battery are easy to unlatch, making battery swaps on the fly very quick. And the charging port allows you to open it while it's in the cage so that you can plug it into an external battery for longer rides. And although I'm spoiled by higher bit rates on more expensive cameras, the lower bit rate on this camera is not enough for most people to notice while increasing the amount of time you can record by quite a bit. Now, as mentioned earlier, the image stabilization compared to what I'm used to in this camera is nothing fantastic, but it's better than any budget camera I've ever seen. And this quite easily allows you to freehand this camera in awkward positions while still getting smooth footage. The Brave 7, at least at the time of recording, is holding a strong resale value. So if you want to purchase a budget camera now with good quality, then upgrade later down the road, you can get a good chunk of your money back on something like eBay. Oddly enough, the touchscreen's responsiveness and refresh rate is far better than most of my GoPros. It's a lot less clunky, and since I've been using this camera, it has not frozen up on me once. My GoPros will tend to freeze up at least once per session, which is really annoying. And those cameras have been out for years, with firmware updates constantly being pushed out. This could be incredibly important to some of you who record important footage and can't afford to have the camera freezing up, as GoPro is very well known to do. Akaso, at least with their Brave 7, and I'm sure it's the same with their other cameras, does not require you to activate the camera with your phone, which is a reason why I only own one Insta360 camera and will never recommend an Insta360 on my channel. Requiring the camera to be activated with a phone almost caused it to be a $400 paperweight, as I was unable to do so for 2 days. This is incredibly annoying. So Akaso, thank you for not doing this, and I would recommend never doing it in the future. The front-facing display is very convenient for anyone who would want to use it as a blogging camera or just use the front-facing display to reference their shot when you need to be in front of the camera. Now this is personal preference, but in my opinion I would have omitted the front-facing display and saved that money to use a better sensor in the camera itself, record a higher bitrate, or just improve the overall quality of the camera. The front-facing display is something that I'm hardly ever going to use, but in your situation it might be different. Call me crazy, but I've always looked at action cameras as something that's as simple as possible with the best quality you can get. If I need to vlog or record myself, I could use a smartphone, which almost everybody has. Action cameras are meant to be put in sketchy situations where you don't want to put your phone, so this front-facing display is something that's just not needed. The accessories that come with the Brave 7 are quite generous, maybe a little too much. Personally, I would have gotten rid of most of these mounts and just given us a decent chest mount, which was included with their big accessory kit, and the chest mount is actually pretty good, which I used throughout this entire video. One item in the kit that will be handy for a lot of people, even if I don't use it very often, is the remote. It's high quality, has decent range, so will allow you to start and stop recording from a distance. And because this wrist remote is not just some cheap knockoff version, it actually communicates with the camera, telling you how long you've been recording and battery status, which can be very important in a lot of situations. It's also rechargeable, so you don't have to deal with button cell batteries. This is a big plus. To sum up my opinion about the Akaso Brave 7 is I think it's a great action camera for the price. I know I was a bit brutal in my downs about the camera, but remember what I'm comparing this to. If someone's looking for their first action camera, I don't think they'll be disappointed with this. And anyone who has a creative mind can take advantage of this camera in a lot of situations. If you were to use this camera to start your first YouTube channel, I don't think you would ever run into any comments about its lack of quality, poor stabilization, or audio. Your audience is going to be able to hear you, and the quality is going to be there for decent entertainment. However, if you're somebody who's already used to the more expensive, higher quality cameras, this is definitely something you're going to notice as a downgrade. For me personally, I probably won't be using this as a riding camera. However, I might use it as a bench camera. The field of view is just right along with the detail and its focus. So this is something you probably will see used on the channel throughout the future, just not as an action camera. So I hope you guys got some useful information out of today's video, or at the very least, were mildly entertained. And until next time, ride safe.
Come on, bud. Come on. Yeah, go make. All right, go make. Go make. He's gonna pee right there. He's like, yeah, this is all it's gonna take. Smart dog.